The first mistake was trusting the scanner. In my 300 solar cycles of service as security chief for the Xylosian Imperial Fleet, I had come to rely on the cold, hard data provided by our technology. Our bioscanners were the pinnacle of analytic science, capable of deducing the threat potential of a life form by measuring everything from bone density and muscular hydraulics to neurosynaptic velocity. They were never wrong, until, that is, they met specialist Eva Rostova. The datapad designated her bioform Harmless. It was a classification usually reserved for symbiotic flora or gelatinous life from low-gravity aquatic worlds. It was, I can now state, with the cold certainty of hindsight, the single greatest failure of technology I have ever witnessed. I remember the first time I laid my primary set of eyes upon her. She was assigned to the bridge of my vessel, the Imperial Observer ship Vigilance, as a diplomatic liaison from the newly contacted Terran Alliance. She was underwhelming. The reports had described her species, humans, as fragile, endoskeletal bipeds from a high-gravity death world, but the description did not prepare me for the reality. She was small, barely reaching the median joint of my upper arms. Her skin was soft, lacking any natural plating, and her single pair of limbs seemed spindly and inefficient. Where I possessed a quad-brachial frame, each arm capable of lifting twice my body weight, she looked as though a stern breeze might snap her delicate bones. My crew, all proud Xylosian warriors, shared my assessment. We were a species defined by strength, logic, and biological superiority. Our carapaces were our armor, our forearms our tools and weapons, our multifaceted eyes our window into a universe of predictable physics. The human was an anomaly, a creature of soft tissue and baffling emotion. We heard her apologizing to a service drone that had bumped into her. Apologizing. To a machine. Sub-Commander Zor, my second, let out a low chitter of amusement that I did not bother to stifle. "It speaks to the door," he'd clicked, his mandibles vibrating with mirth. "Perhaps we should assign it a comfort companion, Chief Calyx, a small, furry nutrient block, perhaps." We saw her as a curiosity, an administrative burden. Her workstation was a tiny alcove tucked away from the main command pit, a concession to interspecies protocol that we all found faintly ridiculous. And in a testament to her species' chaotic nature, she immediately made it messy. She had a small metallic frame displaying a static image of a verdant landscape from her homeworld. She had a collection of colored synthetic sticks she used to make marks on processed wood pulp. And most offensively, she had a ceramic vessel, a crude, heavy-looking thing from which she constantly drank a steaming, dark liquid whose aroma was both acrid and strangely compelling. It was a pocket of illogical clutter on my otherwise pristine, sterile bridge. We pitied her. We saw her as a child wandering through a fortress, unaware of the dangers, and we felt the weary superiority of those who were built for such a world. That was our second mistake. Pity is a poison to perception. It blinds you to the truth that is standing right in front of you, smiling. And the human smile, I would learn, was the most deceptive expression in the known galaxy. It was not a sign of joy. It was the baring of teeth. A standard rotation aboard the Vigilance was a symphony of controlled precision. The low, resonant hum of the quantum foam reactor was the baseline, a constant reminder of the contained power at our command. The clicks of my crew's movements on the polished deck plates were percussive and efficient. The soft, synthesized voice of the ship's intelligence announcing status updates was the melody. It was a sanctuary of order in a chaotic cosmos. Into this sanctuary, the human, Rostova, introduced a discordant note of pure, unadulterated randomness. She would hum, not a recognizable melody from any known galactic archive, but a tuneless, breathy sound that seemed to emanate from her without conscious thought. It was, my analysis concluded, a sign of an undisciplined neural state. She would tap her slender digits on her console, not in the efficient rhythmic pattern of a trained operator, but in a series of complex syncopated rhythms that served no discernible purpose. I once spent an entire sub-cycle attempting to decode the pattern, believing it to be a form of primitive, subconscious calculation. I later learned from a cultural database that she was merely bored. The concept was alien to me. A Xylosian is never bored. We are either performing a function or in a state of rest to optimize future function. This Boredom seemed a profound waste of metabolic energy. Her most baffling ritual, however, involved that ceramic vessel. Several times per rotation, she would perform a small personal ceremony. She would pour heated water over a container of ground, roasted seeds, filter the resulting black fluid into her mug, and then add a splash of a white, lipid-rich substance. The process was nonsensical, yet she performed it with a quiet focus that was almost meditative. During one of these moments, I decided to assert my authority and perhaps gain some insight into the creature's psychology. I approached her messy alcove, my forearms crossed in a posture of formal inquiry. "Specialist Rostova," I began, my voice modulator set to a frequency she could easily comprehend. "Your biometric readings indicate a baseline state of agitation. Are your assigned quarters and nutrient provisions satisfactory?" She looked up from her steaming mug, and there it was. That smile. A slight upward curve of the lips, revealing the white enamel of her teeth. My threat assessment instincts, honed over centuries of conflict, registered it as a subvocal display of aggression, a silent warning, but my logic centers dismissed it as primitive facial mechanics. "Everything's peachy, Chief," she replied, her tone bafflingly casual. "Just another Tuesday." My translator offered no coherent meaning for this phrase. Peachy was a type of fruit from her home world. Tuesday was an arbitrary temporal designation. I logged the interaction for my report. Subject exhibits signs of disassociation and communicates in non-standard, possibly nonsensical idioms. Psychological stability remains questionable. As I turned away, I heard Zor click a quiet message to the helm officer. "The primate's brain is overheating. All that dark sludge she drinks must be boiling it." The helm officer's quiet chitter of agreement was all the confirmation I needed. We were all in perfect logical accord. The human was fragile, unstable, and utterly out of her depth. A living, breathing, harmless classification. The symphony of the bridge was shattered by a single, discordant shriek from the proximity alert system. Every Xylosian on duty froze for a microsecond, their combat instincts flaring to life. On the main view screen, the starfield warped, and a ship materialized from the shimmering distortion of a poorly maintained cloaking field. It was a horror I knew well from intelligence briefings. A Croth Reaver-class vessel. Jagged, asymmetrical, and bristling with weapons, it looked less like a starship and more like a weaponized asteroid. My mandibles tightened. The Croth. A species of semi-sentient brutes, bioengineered by a forgotten empire for the sole purpose of shock warfare. They live for the violence of boarding actions, for the visceral thrill of close-quarters combat. They were a Xylosian's worst nightmare, a tidal wave of biological chaos crashing against our fortress of logic and order. But we were the Imperial fleet. We had protocols for chaos. "Shields to maximum saturation," I roared, my voice cutting through the sudden tension. "Charge primary plasma batteries and target their weapon emplacements. Helm, evasive maneuvers, pattern Delta 7. Communications, send a priority 1 distress call to Sector Command." My forearms moved with independent, practiced grace. One gestured to the tactical display, another activated the internal ship-wide comms, a third keyed in my command override codes. I felt the familiar, cold thrum of combat readiness settling over me. The fear was a distant thing, a lower-order impulse suppressed by centuries of Xylosian military doctrine and personal discipline. My crew responded instantly, their movements a blur of efficiency. Consoles chirped, power levels surged, and the Vigilance groaned slightly as she altered course, her powerful inertia dampeners absorbing the G-forces. We were a machine of war, and I was its mind. Amidst this maelstrom of controlled urgency, I chanced a glance at the human's alcove. My analytical mind demanded the data point. How was the fragile creature reacting to a genuine mortal threat? I expected to see her cowering, her face pale with the terror her species was supposedly so prone to. I expected her biometrics, which I had pulled up on a secondary screen, to be a chaotic spike of pure panic. I was wrong on both counts. She had stood up, but her posture was not one of fear. It was one of annoyance. She held her ceramic mug in one hand, staring at the Croth vessel on the view screen as if it were a noisy neighbor disrupting her afternoon. Her biometric readings were even more baffling. Her heart rate had elevated, yes, from a resting 65 beats per minute to a steady 90. Her adrenaline and cortisol levels were spiking, but not in the uncontrolled flood of a panic response. The graph was a smooth, controlled plateau. I cross-referenced the pattern in the ship's medical database. It was a perfect match for the profile of a Xylosian gladiator in the moments before the combat gates opened. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. A low, powerful klaxon suddenly blared, a sound no captain ever wants to hear. "Impact warning! Incoming projectile! Bypassing main shields!" the tactical officer shrieked. It was a grapple torpedo. The Croth weren't trying to fight a ship battle. They were coming aboard, and they were aiming for the command section. The impact was a dull, grinding thud that resonated through the deck plates, a violation of the ship's sovereign integrity. A red icon flashed on the internal schematic display. Hull breach, Deck 3, Section Gamma, the main access corridor leading directly to the bridge. "Boarding action imminent," I bellowed into the comms. "All security teams, converge on Section Gamma, seal internal bulkheads, repel boarders at all costs." The Croth were fast, notoriously so. They used plasma cutters integrated into their grapple claws to slice through a hull in seconds. My security teams, armed with quad-barreled plasma repeaters, were formidable, but the Croth shock troopers were living weapons. This would be a brutal, bloody affair fought in the narrow confines of our corridors. On the bridge, we were in the fortress's keep. The main door was forged from 10 centimeters of mag-sealed titanium alloy, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a portable anti-armor cannon. Still, I unholstered my personal sidearm, a sleek Xylosian plasma caster, its energy cell glowing with a reassuring blue light. My upper right hand tested its weight. My lower left confirmed the charge level. My other two hands remained poised over my command console. A warrior must be ready to fight on all fronts. My gaze flickered again to the human's biometrics. That steady, controlled elevation of her vital signs continued. It was profoundly illogical. Her species had no natural defenses. Her skin could be pierced by a sharpened stick. Her endoskeleton was a lattice of fragile calcium. Faced with the imminent arrival of 300-kilogram killing machines armed with razor-sharp claws, her only logical response should be total systemic shock, catatonia. Yet she stood there, an island of unnerving calm in a sea of controlled military procedure. The distant high-pitched scream of rending metal reached the bridge, followed by the percussive thumps of heavy bodies dropping onto a deck. They were in. My mandibles clicked, a nervous tick I had long since failed to suppress. Security Team Alpha was reporting contact. The comm channel erupted in a cacophony of plasma fire and guttural alien roars. "They're too fast," came the panicked voice of my squad leader. "They have energy dampeners. Our shots they're not as effective." Then, silence from that channel. A cold dread, colder than the vacuum of space, settled in my primary stomach. The Croth were better equipped than our intelligence suggested. They were cutting through my veterans. Then, the unthinkable happened. The heavy thudding was no longer distant. It was right outside the bridge door. A deafening blast, a concussive wave of heat and pressure, blew the mag-sealed titanium door inward as if it were flimsy sheet metal. It crashed against the far bulkhead with a deafening clang, twisted and glowing cherry red at the edges. A shaped charge. They had come straight for the command center. Smoke, acrid and thick, billowed into the bridge. And through the swirling haze, 3 silhouettes emerged. They were even larger than the tactical readouts had suggested. Hulking, quad-limbed monstrosities, their chitinous plates a mottled, sickly green. Their lower arms ended in vicious, curved scythes, while their upper arms held crude, but effective, particle-burst rifles. They were an avalanche of biological violence poised on the threshold of my sanctuary. I raised my plasma caster, my 4 eyes trying to triangulate the optimal shot. The bridge crew recoiled, their training momentarily overwhelmed by the primal terror these things evoked. The first Croth opened its multi-hinged jaw and let out a triumphant, deafening roar. In that moment, I expected the human to scream, to fa, to finally exhibit the harmless behavior her biology dictated. She did not. She moved. It all happened in the space between one frantic pulse of my heart's and the end second one. Before the lead Croth's roar had even finished echoing, Rostova pivoted. It was not a panic scramble, but a fluid, controlled motion originating from her core, a biomechanical poetry that defied every analysis of her fragile endoskeleton. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not dive for cover. She snatched the heavy white ceramic mug from her console. In the same seamless movement, her arm cocked back and then snapped forward. She threw the mug. My tactical brain screamed in confusion. A primitive projectile against armored Croth? It was insanity. But she didn't aim for the invaders. Her target was a small, unassuming panel on the wall right beside the ruined doorway. It was a bright red square, clearly marked in both Xylosian script and galactic standard symbols. Manual override, emergency fire suppression. Second 2. The heavy mug, a piece of crude low-tech pottery, flew with astonishing accuracy. It struck the panel with a sharp crack that was louder than it had any right to be. The ceramic, incapable of handling the kinetic force, exploded into a starburst of white shards. The impact, however, was more than enough to depress the manual activation plate within the panel. For a breathtaking instant, nothing happened. Then, with a deep gut-wrenching whoomp, the nozzles in the ceiling directly above the doorway activated. This was not the water-based sprinkler system of a primitive dwelling. This was a Class A plasma fire suppression system, designed to combat reactor core breaches. It didn't spray water. It ejected a massive high-pressure wave of cryogenic gel foam. Second 3. The 3 Croth warriors, still lunging forward, were hit by a solid wall of sub-zero material. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The foam was designed to absorb thermal energy at an exponential rate. The Croth, with their exothermic, high metabolism biology, were walking furnaces. The cryogenic agent flash froze them from the outside in. Their guttural roars were cut off mid-bellow, turning into a brittle, cracking sound. The leader's scythe-like arm, raised to strike, was frozen solid just centimeters from the helm officer's console. The other 2 were caught in mid-stride, their expressions of brutal fury immortalized under a thick, glittering coat of white ice. 3 grotesque crystalline statues now stood where the invaders had been. The bridge was plunged into an unnerving silence, broken only by the gentle hiss of the dissipating foam and the faint, almost musical tinkling of ice crystals forming on the carapaces of the frozen Croth. A cloud of frigid vapor rolled across the deck, chilling the air and carrying with it the smell of ozone and sudden, absolute death. My arm was still extended, my plasma caster aimed at a target that no longer existed. My 4 eyes blinked in rapid, unsynchronized succession, each one feeding my brain a different angle of the same impossible reality. It was over. The entire boarding action on the bridge, the spear tip of the Croth assault, had been neutralized. Not by plasma fire, not by security forces, but by a harmless human with her morning beverage container. I stood there, a statue of a different kind, my mind a maelstrom of conflicting data streams. The tactical overlays in my vision still painted threat vectors originating from the frozen Croth, but the biological readings were flatline, terminated. My 4 hands trembled slightly, a physiological response I hadn't experienced since I was a young cadet in the high-gravity training chambers of Xylos Prime. The rest of my bridge crew were in a similar state of paralysis. Sub-Commander Zor's powerful mandibles hung slack, a sign of profound shock in a Xylosian. The helm officer was staring at the frozen claw inches from his head, his breathing coming in shallow, rapid bursts. The entire command center, the nexus of a warship's power, was held in a state of collective, awestruck disbelief. And then a sound broke the spell, a soft crunch. It was Rostova. She had calmly walked over to the spot where her mug had shattered against the wall. She nudged a large, curved shard with the toe of her soft-shelled boot. She then turned to face me, her expression unreadable. But then it came, a flicker of that unsettling smile. It wasn't triumphant, it wasn't relieved, it was wry, as if she had just witnessed a mildly amusing inconvenience. "Well," she said, her voice cutting through the frigid silence with startling clarity. "That's a shame. It was my favorite mug." The utter banality of the statement was like a physical blow. She had just single-handedly, and with absurdly unconventional means, annihilated 3 of the most feared shock troopers in the sector, and her primary concern was her broken dishware. My vocalizer finally engaged, the sound a low, gravelly chitter of pure confusion. "How?" I managed to force out, the word feeling inadequate. "How did you... the timing, the precision, how did you know to do that?" I expected a complex answer, a detailed explanation of a forgotten human martial art, a secret government training program, a psychic precognitive flash. I wanted a logical framework to contain the impossible event I had just witnessed. Her response offered no such comfort. She shrugged, a casual gesture that seemed to dismiss the entire event as trivial. "Physics," she stated simply, "and a healthy appreciation for workplace safety regulations." She gestured with her chin towards the fried panel. "Your emergency systems are ridiculously over-engineered. High pressure, rapid deployment, wide dispersal. And you put the manual overrides right next to every major doorway. It's like a design feature just waiting to be used for something other than putting out fires." Her explanation was more shocking than the act itself. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't some mystical human power. It was observation. It was improvisation. She had weaponized my ship's safety features against an enemy I was prepared to fight with dedicated armaments. She had seen not a fire suppression system, but a trap, a tool. The simplicity was terrifying. My Xylosian mind, trained to see things for their designated purpose. A weapon is a weapon, a door is a door, a safety system is a safety system. Could not make such a leap. It was like watching a creature solve a multi-dimensional puzzle by simply turning it on its side. While I was calculating angles of fire for my plasma caster, she was calculating the trajectory of a coffee mug. We were not even playing the same game. The immediate crisis on the bridge was over, but the Croth were still on my ship. My mind, slowly rebooting from its state of shock, returned to my duties. "Security teams?" I barked into the comm, my voice now steady, layered with a new, unfamiliar authority. "The border's command element has been neutralized on the bridge. Converge on their point of entry. Mop them up." The response was a wave of confused but obedient acknowledgments. Without their leadership and the element of surprise, the remaining Croth raiders were quickly overwhelmed by my security forces. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the grim reports of containment and casualty counts. The vigilance was secure, but the bridge remained a frozen tableau. The 3 crystalline statues of the Croth stood as monuments to my ignorance. I walked towards them, my metallic footfalls unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I reached out a hesitant finger and tapped the lead Croth's frozen carapace. It was solid, colder than any natural ice. The cryogenic foam had been so efficient, so utterly absolute. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an execution, a silent, clean, and terrifyingly effective one. I turned back to Rostova. She was at her station, dabbing at her console with a cleaning cloth, trying to wipe away the dark, spattered stains of her favorite mug. The sheer domesticity of the act was surreal. "Specialist," I said, my tone flat, devoid of its usual command authority. "I require a full and immediate report on your actions. Your service file lists no combat training. It lists your qualifications as diplomatic and cultural liaison. Explain." She stopped wiping the console and looked at me. The wry smile was gone, replaced by an expression of deep, professional weariness. It was the look of someone who had been forced to explain the obvious one too many times. "My official designation is Diplomatic Liaison, Chief Kalix," she confirmed, her voice even. "And my file is correct. It says I am qualified in interspecies de-escalation and crisis management." She then turned back to her console and tapped a single key. A new data packet was immediately routed to my personal command display. It was locked with a level of encryption that even I, as security chief, would have needed hours to bypass. But she had just opened it for me. The file header read, "Rostova, EVA, Service Record, Classified, Eyes Only, Omega Clearance." I began to read. Interspecies de-escalation was, as I suspected, a grotesque euphemism. Her field of expertise was listed as asymmetric threat neutralization. The phrase sent a shiver down my primary spinal column. It was a term for dealing with threats that could not be fought with conventional force. Threats that required you to change the very rules of the engagement. I scrolled through the mission logs. The Vexian swarm on Cygnus X1, Subject utilized sonic resonance of cave systems to trigger catastrophic biological failure in hive mind consciousness. The Silicon Scourge of the Keltari Nebula. Subject introduced a recursive logic virus via a broadcast of a primitive Terran mathematical theorem, causing total systemic collapse. The Croth were thugs. These were galactic-level extinction threats. And she had faced them. The commendations were not for bravery or marksmanship. They were for exploitation of environmental variables, leveraging of psychological weaknesses, and unconventional resource application. The harmless classification from the scanner wasn't an error. It wasn't a mistake. It was camouflage. It was a deliberate, calculated lie. A weaponized piece of data designed to make everyone, from enemy warlords to allied security chiefs, underestimate the small, soft-skinned creature in the room. The most dangerous weapon, my shattered worldview was beginning to understand, is the one you have been trained to ignore. My 4 eyes stared at the glowing script of her real service record, then flicked back to the woman herself, who was now meticulously picking up the larger shards of her broken mug and placing them in a refuse receptacle. The entire paradigm of Xylosian military philosophy, a doctrine built and perfected over 1,000 cycles of warfare, crumbled into dust. We believed in overwhelming force, in superior biology, in technological dominance. We announced our strength with the size of our ships and the power of our weapons. Humanity, it seemed, had learned a different lesson. They had learned to hide their strength, to disguise their deadliest weapons as diplomats and their most brilliant tactical minds as harmless liaisons. I finally understood the smile, the baring of teeth. It wasn't a subconscious threat display. It was a conscious act of misdirection, a mask of placid friendliness worn by a creature that had survived by outthinking things that could tear it in half. Her humming wasn't a sign of an undisciplined mind. It was the idle thought of a predator so confident in its environment that it felt no need for high alert. She wasn't ignoring the danger. She had already calculated a dozen ways to end it before it even began. My vocalizer felt stiff, my tongue thick. I asked a question that had no place in a post-action debriefing, an illogical, emotional, human question. "Why?" I began, my voice a low chitter. "Was that mug your favorite?" It was a desperate grasp for a piece of data that might make sense in this new, terrifying reality. She paused in her cleanup, holding a particularly large, curved piece of ceramic in her palm. She looked at it, her expression turning strangely analytical. "It was heavy," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Good thermal retention, kept the coffee hot for a long time. And the base was solid, perfectly weighted." She tossed the shard a few centimeters in the air and caught it, made a good paperweight. She paused, her gaze lifting from the shard to meet mine directly. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, seemed to bore right through my exoskeleton. "Or, a projectile." She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. "You never know when you'll need a good rock. It's a Deathworlder thing." A good rock. That phrase. The casual, almost dismissive mention of the most primitive weapon imaginable, spoken by a creature who had just wielded cryogenic technology like a thrown stone, chilled me to my very core. It was the nexus of their philosophy, the fusion of primitive brutality and hyper-advanced intellect. They hadn't abandoned the rock. They had just learned how to build better ones, and to find them in places no one else would ever think to look. In that moment, I realized the Croth hadn't been defeated by a human. They had been defeated by millions of years of evolution on a planet that tried its best to kill them every single day. They had been defeated by the simple, brutal cunning of an ape that had learned to throw rocks. And I, in all my Xylosian superiority, had provided her with the very rock she needed. The cleanup crews finally arrived, their movements hesitant and quiet. They were from the engineering division, not hardened security troops, and they stared at the frozen Croth with wide, unnerved eyes. They worked in near silence, their usual clatter and banter absent. They used grav sleds to carefully maneuver the 3 ice sculptures out of the bridge, their forms casting long, monstrous shadows in the corridor beyond. The rest of the bridge crew, the ones from my shift, gave Rostova a wide, respectful berth. The earlier mockery and pity had evaporated, replaced by a palpable and deeply unsettling aura of fear. Sub-Commander Zor, my proud, logical second-in-command, busied himself with damage reports on the far side of the bridge, pointedly refusing to even glance in the human's direction. He had witnessed a fundamental law of the universe be broken, and his mind couldn't cope. I dismissed the traumatized crew, ordering a fresh shift to take their places. For a few minutes, as the shifts changed over, Specialist Rostova and I were alone on the bridge, surrounded by the ghosts of the action. I sank into my command chair, the familiar contours offering no comfort. My four arms, usually poised for action, rested limply on the armrests. I felt obsolete. My strength, my training, my technology, it all felt like a child's toy in the face of what I had just seen. The scanner classified you as harmless, I stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a eulogy for my certainty, a quiet admission of a catastrophic failure of understanding. Rostova finished her cleanup and leaned against her now spotless console, crossing her arms. The posture was casual, but I now saw the coiled readiness within it. "The scanner is a machine, Chief Kalix," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of a lecture. "It measures what you Xylosians value: kinetic potential, metabolic rate, dermal armor, muscle density. It measures what a thing is in a physical sense." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "It can't measure what a being is willing to do. It can't measure desperation or ingenuity, or the simple, hard-won fact that my species survived for 200,000 years by being clever little monsters. We learned to kill things 10 times our size, first with pointy sticks and well-thrown rocks, then with other things." She gave me that smile again, the one I was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't for me. It was for herself, a private acknowledgement of a savage truth. "The scanner was right in a way," she continued, her logic a cruel, twisting knife. "On this bridge, surrounded by trained Xylosian warriors and armed with plasma casters, I was harmless." Her eyes flicked to the ruined doorway and the faint shimmer of cold still hanging in the air. The fire suppression system, on the other hand, that was very, very harmful. And there it was, the final terrifying piece of the puzzle. The human did not see herself as the weapon. She was merely the trigger. The environment was her weapon. The ship, my ship, was her arsenal. This wasn't just tactical thinking. It was a philosophical recontextualization of reality itself, a way of seeing the world that was so alien, so dangerously adaptable, that it made our rigid doctrines seem laughably primitive. From that solar cycle forward, my life and my career were irrevocably altered. My first act was to personally delete the recording of Sub-Commander Jor's dismissive comments about the primate. It was not an act of kindness, but of preservation. Such ignorance could not be allowed to exist in the official record. My second act was to sit down and rewrite the entire Xylosian fleet security doctrine for the Vigilance. For 3 straight cycles, I worked without rest, my mind alight with a terrifying new clarity. The old protocols, based on technological superiority and predictable threat assessment, were discarded. Rule number 1 was no longer trust the technology. It became simply observe the human. I began to watch her, not with the condescending pity of before, but with the focused, obsessive attention a scientist gives a dormant supernova. I saw everything differently. I saw her tracing the lines of power conduits under the deck plates with her eyes. I saw her tapping a bulkhead and listening to the faint reverb, no doubt calculating its structural integrity. I saw her reading the chemical composition reports from the atmospheric recyclers, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't living on my ship. She was mapping it. She was learning its secrets, its pressure points, its hidden vulnerabilities. She was turning my fortress into her personal armory, piece by piece, system by system, without ever touching a weapon. Her smiles became coded messages I desperately tried to decipher. A slight tight-lipped smile when a new cargo shipment was loaded meant she was cataloging new potential resources. A wide, tooth-baring grin while watching a star go nova on the view screen was, I theorized, an appreciation for overwhelming, chaotic energy. The crew changed too. The fear slowly subsided, replaced by a wary, almost religious respect. When Specialist Rostova requested a technical schematic, it was delivered instantly. When she asked a question about the ship's reactor, the chief engineer answered her personally and in exhaustive detail. No one called her the primate anymore. They called her Specialist Rostova, and they said it with the same tone they used to say, Your Excellency. The story of the boarding of the 3 frozen Croth and the favorite mug became a whispered legend among the security officers of the fleet, passed from ship to ship on encrypted channels. It was a cautionary tale, a ghost story told in the dark recesses of mess halls, a reminder that the greatest threat isn't always the one with the biggest claws or the most powerful cannon. The story, as I have recorded it here, is my official log entry regarding the incident, my formal report. At the end, I added a final, personal addendum, a recommendation to the highest levels of Imperial Command. I formally requested that the classification Harmless be permanently and irrevocably purged from all Alliance databases when applied to the species known as human. I argued that the term was not just inaccurate, it was a tactical liability of catastrophic proportions. I suggested they needed a new classification. I did not write dangerous. I did not write hostile or threat level maximum. I searched the human cultural archives she had given me access to, looking for a word that fit. I found one from an ancient myth about a gift that should never be opened. I suggested one word for her species, Pandora, a beautiful, intriguing gift that contains unforeseen and world-altering ruin. And I know, with a cold, hard certainty that has settled deep within my exoskeleton, that the galaxy has absolutely no idea what kind of box it has just opened.